Welcome students. Today we are going to talk about optimism in workplace, happiness as well as well-being. Very significant concepts with relation to the behavior in the workplace. What is optimism? Optimism is defined as the power of positive thinking in general. Psychologists define optimism as a cognitive characteristic in terms of generalized positive outcome expectancy or and a positive causal attribution. It is also used in relation to other positive concepts such as hope and emotional intelligence. We're going to talk about emotional intelligence also in one more session. Optimism is considered as key component of the modern positive psychology, a very important concept that. The positive influence of optimism on psychological as well as physical health, motivation, and achievement as such in athletic, academic, occupational, as well as political sciences has been well documented. There is a lot of research seen on that. There are different positive approaches to work behavior, such as spiritual intelligence as well as emotional intelligence. In certain other modules, soon we will be talking about emotional intelligence as well as spiritual intelligence. And these spiritual intelligence, emotional intelligence, all these concepts, all these approaches help in maintenance of optimism. What are the dimensions of optimism? Optimism can be viewed as a part of the human nature. It can be very much a human nature. Early psychologists and philosophers thus considered optimism, on the other hand, as a negative aspect, and they claimed optimism as an illusion. Only around 1960s and 1970s, psychologists realized that many people have a positive bias to themselves than the actual reality. This positive bias was further considered by neuropsychologists, evolutionary psychologists, as well as anthropologists as a part of human nature. Thus, I am telling you that optimism can be viewed as a part of human nature. Modern psychology treats optimism as an individual difference as people have varying degrees of optimism. Treating optimism as an individual difference focuses on cognitively determined expectations and causal attributions. Seligman has identified causal attributions that optimists and pessimists tend to use to interpret bad events. Both do not interpret the same event as bad or as in the same way. Now, what is this optimism and pessimism that I have been talking about? And what did Seligman say about that? According to Seligman, pessimists make internal, stable, and global attributions. Internal means about their own faults. Stable means they will last for a long time. Global, they will undermine everything that they do. So put together, pessimists make internal, stable, global attributions. Optimists, on the other hand, make external, unstable, and specific attributions. Now, what is this? Again, external, that it is not their fault. Unstable, this is only a temporary setback. Specific, problem only in this situation and that I cannot generalize it. So this is the difference between the pessimists and the optimists. But then is optimism so great that it does not have any drawbacks? Optimism can also have its drawbacks. It can have certain dysfunctions, drawbacks, as well as costs. For example, an individual who tends to be optimistic about his future health can neglect the needed physical and nutritional maintenance. Or an optimistic manager, for that matter, who goes to the extremes, may neglect making the needed action plans in order to attain the organizational goals. So optimism has been largely neglected as an important concept, and its influence on employee performance was underrated in organizational behavioral studies. Certain unresolved issues with relation to optimism also have to be mentioned. Like, for example, the quantum of optimism. Is it little or optimism or huge or big optimism? Optimism may vary in level and degree in individuals. No two individuals may have the same level of optimism. Then optimism versus pessimism. Though optimism and pessimism are considered to be mutually exclusive, they may not be exclusive. Learning and sustainable optimism. Although optimism is sometimes considered as a stable personality trait, research also shows that optimism can be learned and it can be applied as well. Now, coming to our concept of workplace optimism. Workplace optimism is a characteristic of the climate of the team or the organization. Regardless of the personal leanings towards optimism or pessimism, the feeling of hope creates a positive work experience for those who are working in that organization. There is more to optimism than only staying positive. It's a strategy which looks to seek new opportunities and develop deep emotional courage and resilience in spite of the setbacks. When an obstacle is thrown their way, optimistic individuals can pivot and identify potential new opportunities. Optimistic individuals can also stay resilient in the face of adversities. They understand that there is a lesson which is learned from each challenge. So here it is looked more than the threat as a challenge. Optimism is a very positive force within the workplace. Why? Because optimism is motivated and is also motivating. It has the desirable characteristics of achievement, health, and perseverance. It makes external, unstable, and specific attributions of personal bad events and is linked with positive outcomes such as occupational success. So, though optimism has been proven as a positive power at workplace, we have to remember that only realistic optimism will lead to effective leadership. It should not be misinterpreted with a false optimism, a fake optimism, or undue optimism. What are the various roles where optimism becomes valuable in any organization, in any workplace? Some jobs and careers where optimism is valuable are those like advertising, social services, health, customer service, product design, public relations, sales, and others. But there are also areas where optimism may not be found very suitable. There are jobs which are not suited for those who are highly optimistic, for those people. And a level of mild pessimism would be beneficial in such jobs. What are those kinds of jobs? Like, for example, accounting, financial control, technical jobs related to safety and all. You have to be a pessimist and you have to think about, you have to be the devil's advocate, you have to think about the negative outcomes. Only then you will be able to provide the best of services in anticipation of something which is usually unanticipated. That is where undue optimism may not be helpful in such cases. Now let us briefly talk about the application of optimism. Let's talk about the half full or the half empty. Though not extensive, the research on optimism in workplace is found to be on the rise in organizational behavioral literature. Some people view their life and day-to-day events happening in their life, that is like a glass, as half full, that is an optimist. An optimist looks at the half full glass, while some view the same glass as half empty, and these are the pessimists. Let's take a work-life example and discuss. Consider two executives who failed to get their promotion because of negative evaluations from their boss. Two of them, two executives. Let's talk about one executive who is half empty. This half empty executive reacts to this snub by his boss in a rage. He gets angry. He has fantasies of killing his boss, complaining to anyone who would listen to his unfair treatment, and even he goes on a drinking binge. He was feeling as though the life was over. He avoided his boss and he looked down whenever he was passing by him in the hall. In an interview, however, the same half empty executive admitted that though he was angry as well as disappointed, he still felt that he was not capable enough to be promoted. and he was not in a position to change. Now let us look at the other side of the coin, the half full executive. The half full executive who did not also get his promotion was also shocked and upset. But he reasoned to himself instead of going into a rage. In an interview, he admitted that he always disagreed to his boss, and both were different people altogether. They had different opinions. So he was not very surprised for not being rated well. Instead of grumbling, he discussed the situation with his wife to determine what must have gone wrong and how he could possibly correct it. He realized that maybe he was not giving his best at work and decided to discuss it further with his boss. Next time in the meeting with the boss, he had a proper discussion where boss admitted that perhaps he was wrong and he admitted that he was not giving his fullest at work. Now let's go to another example. This is a half full case and someone all of us know pretty well, and Baskin of American Express. She was relieved of her duties as head of Optima Card Division when it was discovered that some of her employees had hidden millions of dollars of bad debt. Although not involved, she was held accountable and was shattered by this setback. However, instead of quitting, she was still confident in her abilities and took a lower position, trying to save the company's failing merchandising service division. She made self-examination of what went wrong in the Optima card division and concluded that maybe she was too strict and critical of her people. She reasoned that perhaps this time may have led her people to fear her to a point where they have hidden the losses. She resolved to soften her style and become more open, patient, and a better listener. Using this approach to manage the troubled merchandise service division, she saw that it reached profitability within 2 years. So this is the half full example. Let's take one more example. Arthur Blank, the founder of Home Depot. In 1978, after his personality clashes with his boss at the hardware chain, Andy Dance, he was fired. Arthur Blank has been fired. Instead of getting angry, he got even. He believed his abilities and vision for this type of retailing. He did not give up after the setback at Handy Dance. When an investor approached him, he jumped at the chance to put his talents to work and founded Home Depot. The rest, we all know, is history. That is the power of optimism. What is the difference between these half full optimists and half empty pessimists? The half full optimists interpret bad events in terms of Seligman's explanatory style, and as the examples that I have given indicate, this can result in future positive outcomes. Whereas the half empty pessimists, on the other hand, tend to give up and go into downward spiral after failures or problems. The half full optimists view the setbacks as lessons to be learned for future success, whereas the pessimists look at it the other way. Let's now move on to one more important aspect, which is Seligman's MetLife studies. For studies of optimism in the workplace, Seligman, a well-known name, which all of us have heard of, Seligman leads the way with his pioneering work at Metropolitan Life Insurance. After conferring with the president of this huge company, he was able to test the obvious hypothesis that optimism and its attendant motivation and perseverance were the keys to sales success. A shortened version of his theory-based attributional style questionnaire is ASQ. The acronym is ASQ. This was administered to 200 experienced MetLife agents, insurance agents. This open-ended version of ASQ was designed to determine the habitual explanatory style by asking the respondents to interpret 6 good and 6 bad vignettes in terms of personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness. Importantly, this test has been found to be very difficult to fake optimism. The right answers vary from test to test, and it does certain life scales, and it carries certain life scales to identify those not telling the truth. We call them life scales. Results were that agents who scored in the most optimistic half of ASQ had sold 37% more insurance on average in their first 2 years than agents who scored in the pessimistic half. Agents who scored in the top 10% scored 88% more than most pessimistic 10%. Despite the impressive findings from the initial study, Seligman was not sure whether optimism caused high performance or optimists became high performers. He then conducted a pilot study on 104 new hires who have taken both standard insurance test and ASQ. Interestingly, he found the new insurance agents to be more optimistic than the other group. For example, they can be world class swimmers, baseball stars, community traders. Optimistic scorers were much less likely to quit and did as well as the industry test in predicting performance. Then what Seligman did was he next launched a full-blown study involving 15,000 applicants to MetLife taking both industry test as well as ASQ. 1,000 were hired and importantly 129 more, which were called special force, that had scored in the top half of those taking ASQ but had failed the industry test were also hired. In the first year, the optimists, that is those who scored in the top half of ASQ, but remember they have failed in the industry test, they outsold the pessimists by only 8%, but by second year it was 31%. The special force outsold the hired pessimists in the regular force by 21% in the first year and 57% in the second year. They sold about the same as optimists in the regular force. MetLife, on the basis of Seligman's studies, then adopted ASQ as an important part of their selection process of new agents. So, with this explanation about optimism, I now take you to the next part of the presentation, that is happiness and well-being. Happiness, what is happiness? It's been researched for many centuries. That has been a topic of interest for many centuries. And nowadays, happiness as a concept seems to be readily embraced by majority of the people and appears to be more valued than the pursuit of money, moral goodness, or going to heaven, whatever. During the past 30 years, and especially since the creation of positive psychology and from then on, psychology has turned its attention towards the study of happiness as well as well-being. What is this well-being? There are several reasons why the field of well-being is flourishing at the moment. Survival is no longer a central factor in many people's lives. Though it remains the same for many more, it's not the central factor for many. Quality of life is becoming more important than matters of economic prosperity. Personal happiness is becoming more and more important because of growing trends towards individualism. A number of valid and reliable measures have been developed for the study of well-being. What are the benefits of this happiness and well-being? Research evidence demonstrates the benefits of happiness and well-being, like positive affect and well-being. They lead to sociability, better health, success, self-regulation, helping behavior, and many more. Well-being enhances creativity and divergent thinking. Well-being is even supposed to be associated with longevity, according to certain studies. Happiness, similar to the positive effect, stimulates playing with new ideas. Research also has shown that happy people persist longer at a task that is not really very enjoyable in itself. They are better at multitasking, They are more systematic and attentive. But is this happiness objective or subjective? Well, that's a debate. Whether happiness can and should be measured objectively or subjectively. How are you going to measure our happiness? Some argue that it cannot possibly be measured objectively because none of the obvious behaviors can be linked to happiness in a reliable manner. Even when a person has a very outgoing and friendly experience, which is so frequently observed among happy people, you can still say that they have put on a mask, that person has put on a mask, and that person must have been an unhappy person who has just put on a mask. Others, however, including those like the Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, believed that there can be an objective assessment of happiness. And this could be gathered from averaged out multiple assessments of people's moods over a period of time, not just once or twice, but over a period of time. Thus, a happiness assessment would not need to be tied to memory or retrospective accounts. Nevertheless, the subjective paradigm appears to prevail at this moment. So now we come to a very important concept called subjective well-being. The words happiness and well-being are used interchangeably now because the notion of subjective well-being, in short SWB, is used in research literature. It encompasses how people evaluate their own lives in terms of cognitive and affective explanations and can be represented in a simple formula. SWB equal to satisfaction with life plus affect. I repeat, SWB equal to satisfaction with life plus affect. I'll tell you what it means. The cognitive part of the subjective well-being is expressed by the first half of this equation, life satisfaction. Life satisfaction represents one's assessment of one's own life. One is satisfied when there is little or no discrepancy between the present and what is thought to be an ideal or deserved situation. On the other hand, dissatisfaction is a result of a substantial discrepancy between present conditions and the ideal standard. Dissatisfaction can also be a result of comparing oneself with others. Now, the second part of the formula, affect. This represents the emotional side of SWB. The notion of affect comprises both positive and negative moods and emotions that are associated with our everyday experiences. Common sense is one should feel most happy if one experiences maximum amount of intense positive affect and not very frequent negative affect. But researchers demonstrate that this is not the case. I have listed over here, you see on the slide, 3 types of happiness, which I have talked about, life satisfaction and the affect, that is positive feelings and low negative feelings. Examples I have given and the causes may be seen. What is the importance of intense positive affect, which I have been talking about a while ago? While it is very important to experience positive affect often, the intense positive affect is not necessary for well-being. It appears that intense positive emotions usually come at a price. They are costly, as they are often followed by a period of low affect. Also, they can negatively affect the evaluation of subsequent, that is usually less intense positive experiences. Suppose you had an intense positive experience. After that, there is a positive experience, but not as intense as the previous one. Then it is as though the next experience, which indeed is a positive experience, is not considered well. That's not given any priority or importance. Also, when you face an intense positive emotion, then you would expect that positive emotion to continue, and sometimes after that, even if a normal emotion is there or not so intense, high intense emotion is there, then you may not be happy with it. You may not recognize it at all, give any importance to it at all. So subjective well-being is a combination of contextual factors, cognitive factors, and affective factors, and not just one. How do you nurture this subjective well-being? A number of theories say that it is impossible to permanently change someone's level of happiness. One theory called zero-sum theory says that happiness is cyclical. and that happy and unhappy periods follow each other. Any attempt to increase happiness will soon be nullified by a consequent unhappy period. Another theory claims that happiness is a fixed characteristic and is therefore not open to change. Although happiness is not quite as stable during adolescence and early adulthood and can be affected by major life changes. Therefore, it is more likely that happiness tends to get fixed rather than being fixed from the very beginning. Interesting to note. Then there is one more theory called adaptation theory, which says that although happiness reacts at negative and positive life events, it returns to its baseline shortly afterwards. There may be ups or downs, but it comes back to the baseline shortly afterwards. Lottery winners, for example, soon revert to their normal level of well being. Paraplegics and quadriplegics also seem to adjust to their conditions after some time, and they have to nearly come back to their previous level of well being. It has also been discovered that only life events which occur during the past 2 or 3 months may influence the well being. However, let us also remember that there are certain conditions such as widowhood, loneliness, injustice, and such certain other conditions to which people can never adjust completely. Though we have given a few examples of how people can adjust or come back to their baseline quickly or in some time, there are conditions where they cannot come as well. We should not ignore them. So, students, today we have talked about optimism and several factors associated with it, especially in workplace, how it is viewed, what is half full, what is half empty pattern of looking at things, how optimists look at half full glass, whereas pessimists look at half empty glass. What are the various studies which talk about optimism, especially with special reference to Seligman's studies, and how he has demonstrated the findings of optimism. We also talked about happiness and well-being, and finally, we concluded by talking extensively about subjective well-being. Let's meet once again in another session. This time, we will talk about emotional intelligence. Thank you.